Hello, and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I am Rose Lucibello, Manager of Advancement Events. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture, Emergency Management for All, Meeting the Needs of the Whole Community During Disasters, with Jack Rozdilsky, Associate Professor, Disaster and Emergency Management, Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. I accept the responsibility to acknowledge the land I am on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit of the First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We'd now like to conduct a quick poll before each session begins. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up in front of you. I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Thank you. It's helpful for our speakers to know about who is in our audience. If you need help with Zoom webinar, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period. Please note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you please keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jack Rozdilsky. Jack is an associate professor of disaster and emergency management at York, and in this role, he engages in research, teaching, and outreach. Professor Rozdilsky is an expert in disaster and emergency management, including hurricanes and tornadoes, and his areas of expertise span across natural disasters, disaster mitigation, response and recovery, and much more. We are pleased you could take the time to join us today. Welcome, Dr. Rozdilsky.
Thank you, Rose, for that kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the host and the Scholars Hub at Home program for hosting me for this afternoon lecture. In opening, I'd like to say right now that Canada faces many challenges to our safety and security. And especially these days, we are seeing that disasters are coming quickly in all shapes and all sizes, impacting our communities in different ways as we speak. What this presentation is about this afternoon is that we need to begin to consider and continue to consider how everyone in the community can come together to better help us cope and manage with these constant disasters that continue to impact the safety and security of our community. So that's what these remarks concern. I'm going to speak for approximately the next 20 minutes on the topic of emergency management for all, meeting the needs of the whole of community during disasters. As suggested in the introduction, I'm a associate professor at York University in the area of disaster and emergency management. For this presentation, I'm going to first of all present the premise of EM for all, EM being an acronym for the term emergency management. The first part of the presentation is going to speak to the concept in some bigger picture generalized terms. Second, I'm going to specifically provide some examples of how the concept can be applied in the way of what does EM for all apply to? And I'm going to show brief vignettes of two examples of how the emergency management for all concept can apply to managing disasters in our communities. Then I'm going to end with a few concluding remarks on the emergency management for all concept. So I'm going to start out with the premise of emergency management for all, or a general overview of the concept. I'd like you to think about what Canadian communities look like in 2023. Uh, who lives amongst us? What types of social and cultural practices exist in our communities? What are the latent strengths that diversity brings to our community? And also, what are the existing weaknesses that diversity brings, which present our community with various challenges? I'm speaking to you from the city of Toronto, which is a very diverse community. And on a day to day basis, we see the strengths that diversity brings to the Toronto community. And also, occasionally, we see the challenges that need to be addressed when we deal with governance, management, and just day to day life in a very diverse community. What I'm specifically concerned with is the management of emergencies. How does the provision of emergency public services during disasters acknowledge our diverse communities? In some cases, it does. In other cases, perhaps we can do better. The emergency management for all concept is based on something that we call a concept of a whole of community. This concept is not necessarily something that's new. In the domain of emergency management, it was a concept developed in the United States partly, and the recent iterations were promulgated by FEMA, which is the National Disaster Emergency Management Agency in the United States. And at that time, FEMA was attempting to be more responsive in its activities and programs to the diverse population of the United States. Um, the concept of whole of community involves the need for increased individual preparedness and more widespread community engagement to enhance the overall resiliency and security of communities. Now, that concept of thinking about how we can increase overall individual preparedness and enhance community engagement to increase resiliency and security of communities is a concept that at the time did apply to the United States. It still applies to the United States to this day. And I would take that a step further to suggest those types of concepts also have direct application to Canada. So, in the project I am speaking about today at York University, I am a part of a team looking at how the whole of community concept can be applied in its own uniquely Canadian ways. The whole of community concept is based on some specific principles. Uh, those principles include to understand and meet the actual needs of the whole community, because in some cases, we find before we want to take action to advance emergency management for all, we have to understand what that all means, who exists in our community, what cultures, what practices, what patterns. what do our communities look like? Also, engaging and empowering various parts of the community becomes important when we consider a whole of community action strategy. Also, looking at the community and realizing that there are strengths that exist in the community, and due to our diversity, I think we need to both acknowledge what works in the community and then build upon that. And sometimes we take for granted the power that diversity gives us in our community to apply to making our communities a better place to live in day-to-day life. But also when things in our community start to go wrong, those same strengths do not go away and they can be applied to assist us in managing crisis in the community. Following on the whole of community principle, there are also some strategic themes which can be adapted to action. Those include understanding community complexity, recognizing community capabilities and needs, fostering relationship relationships with community leaders, building and maintaining partnerships between the public sector, private sector, and community itself, empowering local actors to take local actions, and leveraging social infrastructure and assets for the good of the community. So, what does this EM for all concept means? It means that we begin to build on the basis of the whole of community concept, which I have just described in the last two slides. That recognition that during times of normalcy, communities are made up of a diverse population, but then taking that further to acknowledge also that during times of crisis, those same factors of diversity are still in play and still very important. Identification of challenges to overcome and opportunities to build on to support emergency management in a diverse whole of community environment, I think is an important action that we need to have more focus on in Canada. And that's what this project is about. Now, when taking it a step further, this is a long-term effort of two professors in the Disaster and Emergency Management program at York University, where myself and a colleague have formed a diverse team providing different perspectives on how communities manage emergencies. And again, we are exploring how this whole of community concept can be applied and incorporated into disaster management strategies for Canada. That project team is specifically myself and one of my colleagues who is also a associate professor in the Disaster and Emergency Management program. Her name is Dr. Ida Mumaji. What I'd like to do next in the presentation is give a brief explanation of what does the emergency management for all concept apply to by giving two examples. I've previously spoken some broad general terms about the concept, but now I'd like to attempt to bring it home to actual examples of applications on the ground. I have two brief examples I'd like to show. One is from wildfire evacuation that is related to the concept of understanding the actual needs of the whole community. The second example I like to look at is something from COVID-19 and COVID-19 social countermeasures related to recognizing community capacity during disaster. Example number one comes from the emergency management issue of wildfire evacuation. This information is drawn from some work done a few years ago related to the Fort McMurray wildfire evacuations, but concepts and principles from this work can be looked at and applied to things we have going on more recently, including the recent evacuation of the entire city of Yellowknife earlier this year due to the wildfires. But what we're looking at here, Fort McMurray faced a large scale evacuation during the 2016 wildfire season, an evacuation of approximately 88,000 persons. That evacuation impacted the whole community, including the large Muslim population of the city. Now, Fort McMurray has about 10% of the population being Muslim, where Muslims represent the largest visible minority group in Fort McMurray. A research project worked to collect and document the lived experiences of Fort McMurray's Muslim community during the evacuation, and analysis of the specific community's experience worked to provide new insights for emergency management practitioners to consider concerning how we manage large scale wildfire evacuations where an entire city needs to be evacuated. How this work took place, there was a period of field work myself and my colleague, Dr. Mumaji, engaged in to attempt to better understand what the actual needs of the community were during the fire evacuations. And that considered embedding in the community for both interactions with the Muslim community and also observing the early stages of the recovery process from the wildfires. From that research, it was determined that the Muslim community was overwhelmingly appreciative of all the emergency services that were provided to them throughout Alberta during the evacuations. However, at the same time, issues such as availability of culturally appropriate food and clothing and spaces and having spaces available for spiritual accommodation in mass shelters and evacuation centers provided for challenges faced by the Muslim community during the evacuations. So our takeaway point was that more learning needs to take place to consider culturally appropriate how culturally appropriate services can be provided during times of disaster. In this case, culturally appropriate services applied during times of wildfire evacuation. The second brief example I like to show relates to COVID-19 and social countermeasures. You may remember during the early stages of before we had the vaccines available, there were members of the Canadian Asian community who faced misplaced blame and stigma due to early actions they took when we were first learning in early 2020 that we were in the midst of a global pandemic emergency. A research project in 2020 and 2021, which is still ongoing today, is looking at documenting the lived experiences of the Chinese Canadian community in Toronto. And one of the accomplishments of the project was to document those lived experiences in the early days of the pandemic. We found that there was a homegrown ability of that community to protect themselves and others in the early days of the pandemic. Actions like social distancing and masking were taking place in early 2020 throughout the Chinese Canadian community in the greater Toronto area. And those actions were taken well before public agencies mandated that the same actions be taken for everyone and later in the spring of 2020. So, what happened in that project? We again documented the lived experiences of a specific segment of our community, and we documented examples of early precautionary measures in place for COVID-19 safety in Toronto's Chinese community. From that COVID-19 related research, we found that there was a situation that was not necessarily recognized, that the Chinese Canadian community was taking advanced actions for safety before many of us were aware of what was happening with the pandemic. But at the same time, as the Chinese Canadian community was taking those advanced actions, such as wearing masks before many others of us were, they began facing stigma for doing so. So, our takeaway point here is to recognize, not discourage, the capacities that diverse communities bring to the table in times of emergencies. So, in summary, in terms of concluding points for the presentation this afternoon, during an emergency, the weaknesses of a diverse community can become amplified. A bad situation can be made worse. In some cases, things just fall through the cracks. For example, with the Fort McMurray wildfire evacuations and with any large scale evacuation of the city, such as fire evacuations we have seen this year, sometimes things just fall through the cracks. It's not necessarily anyone's fault that we are recognizing the needs as they emerge during a crisis, but the point is to not ignore that sometimes during crises, needs of specific members or communities are not being met, and be willing to recognize those and make adaptations to meet those needs. And then, more importantly, the next time around, when we manage similar types of emergencies, to attempt to do better. Also, during an emergency, the strengths of a diverse community can come out and be put into use. That is, if we recognize and acknowledge those strengths, because leveraging the strengths that exist in our diverse communities does not happen automatically. We need to acknowledge what's going on and create situations where these strengths can be put into practice. For example, we can look back now when COVID first came into Canada in January 2020 and recognize that from our observations in the greater Toronto area, members of the Canadian Chinese community were taking advanced actions to protect themselves. And only later on did we realize those advanced actions were the types of actions that were put into place for everyone in the province in terms of factors such as masking, social distancing, etc. So again, we have existing strengths in our community brought about by our diverse communities, but we need to acknowledge them, recognize them, and leverage them in times of disaster. So, in conclusion, work is going on at York University to look at specific Canadian disasters. And I mentioned two specific cases here, one having to do with wildfires and one having to do with the pandemic, to consider how emergency management tools and techniques can be applied. In this presentation, we considered wildfire evacuation as a tool and technique for safety. And we also considered emergency public health measures that can be used to fight COVID, such as masking and social distancing. And we also need to understand how the lived experiences of members of Canada's diverse communities play out during emergencies. And in this presentation, we gave consideration to the Muslim community in Fort McMurray and to the Chinese Canadian community in the Greater Toronto area. Um, all of this is done to better understand how emergency management can work to meet the needs of all members of our community, because we are finding that when it comes to emergency management strategies in our diverse community, that it is not a one size fits all proposition. That is the conclusion of my remarks. And I would like to thank you for your attention. And I will turn the floor back over to Rose. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor, for that timely and super informative talk. To the audience, we now have time for questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And for those of you watching live on Facebook, you are also welcome to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for the video. We're going to start with one question for you, Professor. So for vulnerable populations who are impacted by a disaster, how do needs shift as the disaster response becomes prolonged?
Thank you. And that's an important question because when we consider how disasters work, disasters take place in phases. Immediately after the disaster, there is a disaster response. Then after the response, we move into disaster recovery and disaster mitigation. And then eventually, once things get sorted out, we begin preparing for the next disaster to happen again. And the cycle repeats over and over again. But in terms of needs shifting, in the time immediately after the disaster or disaster response, we need to acknowledge that it's often an all hands on deck situation. We do the best we can to meet the needs of everyone with the available resources, and it's not a perfect situation. Um, Sometimes it's whatever we have at the time that is needed to get by hour until we begin to grasp the scope of the crisis and begin to put systems in place. Now, as now use the example of wildfire evacuations. When if we would have a wildfire evacuation again, which is a likely scenario, where in the north or west an entire city is evacuated, the city may have members of the Jewish community who would prefer kosher foods, members of the Muslim community who would prefer halal foods. Now, in the immediate hours after the evacuation, when they first show up at an evacuation center, not all needs may be in place to meet the dietary requirements of everybody who happens to show up when we evacuate entire communities.
Mm.
But at the same time, I think we can anticipate what type of needs exist in communities and plan for them. And then when the needs, and what I mean by time moving on and needs shifting, when we realize the scope of the crisis and when hours turn into days, turn into weeks, as what we have seen this summer with the wildfire evacuations, where at times populations have been removed from their homes for weeks at a time before they're able to be safely repatriated. That's the time where I think emergency services can begin to better understand and provide for the diverse needs of a community. For example, when mass feeding operations take place, making compensation for who may need to be fed in terms of a whole of community, and then providing various dietary options for specifically for specific cultures to have appropriate services available to them during times of disaster response.
Hmm. So a question that came in from the audience is, how do we translate this information into actions from our politicians and bureaucrats?
Um, the question is translating this information to actions for
Mhm.
politicians and bureaucrats.
Yeah.
There's a number of different ways that can happen, and I might suggest two. Way number one is the way that we would prefer this not to happen. That way is when a disaster happens, a community is thrust into crisis, and then during the disaster response and recovery, we see people's needs not being met. We see things go wrong, and the extent of the controversy when things go wrong may draw the attention of bureaucrats and politicians to take actions to correct situations that perhaps should not have been as bad as they were in the first place. In other words, we don't want another disaster after the disaster. So that is when things go wrong, that's one way to get the attention of politicians and bureaucrats to make change. But the second way I would like to mention is preferably we would like to perhaps be able to recognize and anticipate potential scenarios that will play out during disaster response and recovery. And what this work is trying to do is add that additional layer of looking at the diversity of Canadian communities and some of the scope of culturally appropriate services that we could perhaps anticipate should be applied in situations where culturally diverse communities are facing circumstances where they need aid in terms of disaster response. And then perhaps the needs can be recognized, services can be set in place to quickly be able to make adaptations on the fly, or to be able to, in the first place, have a scope of culturally appropriate services available to the whole of our community in times of disaster response and recovery.
Mhm. So a question that came in from Facebook is, obviously the types of disasters you're dealing with can be so diverse, right? So even comparing the pandemic to wildfires is very different kind of boat. So there isn't really one solution to how, like, how do you address the varying types? Are there different things that should be put factored into place depending on the type of disaster? Like, what would you say to that?
And that's one thing that makes this difficult. I think that the questioner is very wise to acknowledge the diversity of threats we face in Canada, where disasters can come to us from our natural environment or natural origins. With natural disasters we're all familiar with, such as wildfires. At other times, disasters can come from our technologies, or when our technologies fail. Things like factory explosions, train crashes, failings of technology, etc. And then, unfortunately, disasters also come to us through social origin and social causes, such as civil disturbances, terrorism, targeted attacks, etc. Now, when we consider whether we're dealing with a natural, technological, or socially or a disaster of social origin, um, there are different response techniques, and each disaster brings about specific management strategies to try to cope with the response and recovery. Now, what this project is trying to do is look at a wide scope of disasters and crises. I'm not going to suggest um, myself and my colleague, Dr. Mumaji, who are working on this research, necessarily have the answer yet to what those common strategies can be. But what one of our hypotheses are in continuing this work is to look at a number of different disaster circumstances where we have disasters of different types. When we have those different case studies of disasters of different origins, look at situations of how the whole of community needs were met or not met. In other words, how principles of emergency management for all either were applied to better the situation or were perhaps not present, making the situation worse. And by looking at a series of comparative cases with different disaster types, we think over time we might be able to find elements of common elements and strategies to apply across disasters that would help us better manage disasters in culturally appropriate ways for Canada. So I apologize. We don't necessarily have the solution yet,
Mhm.
but we think by looking at multiple different disaster situations, we may be able to go in the direction to find commonalities that would apply.
So that is a nice segue into, of course, you're speaking to what happens when the disaster has struck, various types, of course. But another question that has come from the audience is what actions can be taken prior to a disaster, which can help to, the disaster management to better understand, who lives in the community. So what pre-actions can happen so that, like you said, those feeding things, knowing who would need, all of that, what could be done just before to just always be ready.
And I guess if we look at if we, the easiest way to answer this would be to look at a municipal or regional municipality level in Canada, where we have men and women in place in the public sector whose duties relate to managing emergencies and crisis for the community. Now, these men and women have their hands full dealing with a variety of preparedness techniques for the next disaster, training, management of emergency operations centers, and then when the disaster happens, it becomes to be an all hands on deck situation. But what we're suggesting is that in addition to dealing with the day to day technical task of emergency management, that it would be beneficial for the men or women who are acting as emergency managers to attempt to take a step out of their comfort zone, to interact with and learn more about the makeup of the community in which they live or work. There's an old adage in emergency management that you never want to meet someone for the first time and shake their hand when the disaster is going on around you. It would be preferable that you have met somebody, you know what they do, you know how they can help contribute, you're aware of their circumstances situations, you're aware of their compliments and also aware of their complaints before the disaster takes place. Then I would suggest by having this general awareness of the nature of the resources that exist in our diverse communities and how they can help themselves, but also having awareness of some of the weaknesses of our communities that exist during peacetime, that one can go into a disaster realizing perhaps the weaknesses that exist right now are going to be exacerbated when the disaster happens. How do we attempt to keep that to a minimum? But at the same time, knowing in the back of our head that there may perhaps be specific cultural, ethnic, religious communities in our midst that bring with them specific skills, specific knowledge, specific that contribute a specific piece of the community fabric that can become very important to tap into and leverage when the community needs to help itself go through the coping of times of immediately after a disaster, but then come together to attempt to recover and rebuild in ways that solve problems that solve the immediate problem of recovering from the disaster, but perhaps attempting to also recover in ways which make the community better than it was before. But really, all of that is premised on having a deep understanding of the makeup of our diverse communities before the disasters happen. So, in some senses, what we're looking at and what this project is advocating for is for disaster and emergency managers to somewhat step outside of their comfort zone and interact with and understand communities in ways which are not necessarily assigned to them to do in their day-to-day duty. But at the same time, I think having that deeper understanding of the lived conditions in our communities would go a long way toward helping us better get through times of crisis in the communities in which we live and work.
Great. So we are coming close to time, but I want to ask you the one final question that did come in through Facebook. And of course, your focus has been on, you spoke to the Chinese community in Toronto and the Muslim community in Fort McMurray. But this question actually kind of took a different angle, and they're wondering if there's anything that is being done for disability inclusive disaster management practices, because of course that's just a whole other set of people who would require, different type of help.
Yes, that's a very good question, and I did not. This given we want to have an afternoon lunch presentation versus a 5-hour afternoon presentation. I did not highlight all aspects of the project,
Mhm.
but there is an aspect of the project we were looking at in relationship to flooding, which took place in the Bracebridge area, and how people with disabilities in that community were able to adapt and not adapt to circumstances related to flooding slightly north of the Toronto area. So it's a very good point is brought up that in terms of social vulnerabilities, people with disabilities have very specific requirements that need to be met in the aftermath of emergencies. And at present, there is acknowledgement and some programs in place for government-based emergency management to be aware and cope with those factors. But I would also suggest that we need to find out more about those matters. And one of the aspects of this project, Emergency Management for All, does include looking at cases of people with disabilities and how they fit in terms of specific enhanced social vulnerabilities and how the emergency management community can better meet the needs of those with disabilities in times of disaster.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation. Dr. Wasdilski, thank you so much again for being with us today and taking part in our Scholars Hub talk. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
You are welcome to now turn off your video. For those of you who would like to share today's session with family and friends, it will be posted to our YouTube page at youtube.com/York alumni, York U alumni. You can also watch past lectures you may have missed. We do have one more poll question for you. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? It should pop up on your screen right now. On Wednesday, November 22nd at 12 p.m., join us for Accessibility of Third-Party Transit Apps and Transit Agencies Role, which is our next Scholars Hub talk. To register for that event and to learn more about upcoming sessions at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you and be well.